Margaret Thompson had lived on Maple Street for 43 years. At 72, she still tended her small garden every morning, watering the roses that her late husband had planted decades ago. The neighborhood had changed over the years, but Margaret remained a constant presence, always ready with a warm smile and homemade cookies for the children walking to school. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, Margaret noticed something unusual happening at the house across the street. 3 police cars had pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing silently. She paused her watering, curiosity getting the better of her as she watched officers approach the front door of the Martinez family home. The Martinez family had been good neighbors for the past 5 years. Carlos worked double shifts at the auto repair shop to support his wife Maria and their 2 young children. Margaret had often helped Maria with English lessons and watched the kids when emergencies arose. She knew they were hardworking, honest, people who kept to themselves and caused no trouble. As Margaret continued watching, she saw the officers banging aggressively on the door. Even from across the street, she could hear them shouting commands. When Maria opened the door, still in her bathrobe with little Sophia clinging to her leg, Margaret felt her heart sink. The officers seemed to be looking for Carlos, but Maria was clearly trying to explain something in her broken English. The situation escalated quickly. One of the officers grew impatient with Maria's language barrier and began speaking more aggressively. Margaret could see Maria becoming frightened, stepping backward while trying to shield her daughter. The other children had now appeared in the doorway, confused and scared by the commotion. Margaret knew she had to do something. Despite her age, she had never been one to stand by when someone needed help. She set down her watering can and began walking across the street, her arthritis making each step deliberate but determined. As she approached, she could hear the officers demanding entry to search the house, while Maria kept repeating that Carlos was at work. The lead officer, a tall man with graying hair, noticed Margaret approaching. His expression immediately shifted to annoyance as he turned toward her. Margaret raised her hands peacefully, trying to explain that she knew the family and that Carlos was indeed at his job. She offered to call the auto shop to verify his whereabouts, hoping to defuse the situation. Instead of listening, the officer ordered Margaret to step back and mind her own business. His tone was harsh and dismissive, treating her as if she were nothing more than a nosy old woman. Margaret stood her ground politely, explaining that she was simply trying to help clear up what seemed to be a misunderstanding. The tension in the air was thick as more neighbors began to notice the commotion. Some peered from their windows while others stepped onto their porches, unsure whether to intervene. Margaret could feel their eyes on her as she continued trying to reason with the officers, her voice steady despite the growing hostility she faced. What started as a simple welfare check was rapidly spiraling into something much more serious, and Margaret found herself caught in the middle of a situation that would soon attract the attention of someone completely unexpected. The lead officer's patience had completely run out. When Margaret continued to advocate for the Martinez family, explaining their good character and offering to help translate, he took a step closer to her. His badge read, Officer Reynolds, and his 20-year career had clearly hardened him to civilian interference. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to step back and let us do our job," Reynolds said, his voice carrying a threatening undertone that made several neighbors gasp audibly. Margaret, however, had raised 5 children and buried a husband after 50 years of marriage. She had faced down bullies before and wasn't about to be intimidated now. "Officer, I'm just trying to help you understand that this family are good people," Margaret replied calmly, though her hands were slightly shaking. "If you're looking for Carlos Martinez, he's at Tony's Auto Repair on 5th Street. I can give you the phone number if you'd like to verify." Reynolds exchanged glances with his 2 fellow officers, both younger men who seemed uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. One of them whispered something about just checking the auto shop, but Reynolds waved him off dismissively. The power dynamic had shifted from finding Carlos to asserting authority over what he perceived as civilian interference. Maria Martinez stood in her doorway, tears streaming down her face as she watched this elderly woman defend her family. She wanted to speak up, but her limited English and fear of making things worse kept her silent. Her children had now retreated deeper into the house, frightened by the shouting and tension. I don't need some old lady telling me how to do police work, Reynolds snapped, taking another step toward Margaret. You need to get back to your garden and let the professionals handle this situation. His tone had shifted from authoritative to purely aggressive, and the other neighbors could sense that something terrible was about to happen. Margaret felt her heart racing, but she maintained her composure. I'm not telling you how to do your job, officer. I'm simply providing information that might help you locate the person you're looking for more efficiently. Her words were measured and respectful, but Reynolds had already decided that she was a problem that needed to be dealt with. Without warning, Reynolds grabbed Margaret's arm roughly, his fingers digging into her thin skin hard enough to leave immediate red marks. You're interfering with a police investigation, he declared, though no investigation was actually taking place. Margaret winced in pain but didn't cry out, her dignity intact even as the situation turned physical. The two younger officers looked at each other nervously. This wasn't what they had signed up for when they became cops. Taking down a 72-year-old woman who was trying to help seemed wrong on every level, but Reynolds was their superior, and speaking up could cost them their careers. Several neighbors had now pulled out their phones and were recording the incident. The sight of a police officer manhandling an elderly woman in broad daylight was shocking even for those who had grown cynical about police behavior. Margaret's face showed pain, but not fear. Her decades of life experience having taught her that sometimes standing up for what's right comes with a cost. Just as Reynolds appeared to be preparing to arrest Margaret for the invented charge of interfering with police business, the sound of a car door slamming caught everyone's attention. An expensive black SUV had pulled up to the curb, and a figure was emerging that would change everything about this confrontation. Mike Tyson had been driving through the neighborhood on his way to visit his therapist when he noticed the commotion. At 57 years old, the former heavyweight champion had spent years working on anger management and finding healthier ways to channel his protective instincts. But seeing a police officer rough-handling an elderly woman triggered something deep within him that no amount of therapy could suppress. As he stepped out of his SUV, his imposing 6-foot frame immediately commanded attention. Even in casual clothes, there was no mistaking who he was. The distinctive voice, the powerful build, and the intense stare that had intimidated opponents in the ring for decades were all instantly recognizable. Neighbors stopped recording to stare in disbelief at the legendary boxer walking toward the confrontation. "Hey, what's going on here?" Tyson called out, his voice carrying across the street with natural authority. Officer Reynolds, still gripping Margaret's arm, turned to see who was interrupting now. When he recognized the famous face approaching, his expression shifted from annoyance to confusion and then to something approaching concern. Tyson's presence immediately changed the entire dynamic of the situation. The two younger officers straightened up, suddenly very aware that their actions were being witnessed by someone whose voice carried significant weight in the community. Reynolds, however, was too committed to his course of action to back down gracefully. "Sir, please stay back. This is police business," Reynolds said, trying to maintain his authoritative tone while still holding on to Margaret's arm. But his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments earlier. Facing down an elderly woman was one thing. Dealing with Mike Tyson was an entirely different challenge. Tyson walked closer, his movements measured and controlled. Years of boxing had taught him the importance of staying calm under pressure, and his therapy sessions had helped him learn to use his intimidating presence constructively rather than destructively. He could see the fear in Margaret's eyes and the pain in her face where Reynolds was gripping her. "Officer, that's somebody's grandmother you're putting your hands on," Tyson said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "What could this old lady possibly have done that requires you to grab her like that?" The question was reasonable, but coming from Mike Tyson, it sounded more like a challenge than a request for information. Margaret looked up at this unexpected savior with gratitude and amazement. She had watched Tyson fight on television in his prime, but never imagined she would meet him, much less that he would come to her defense. Despite her pain, she managed a small smile of appreciation. Reynolds found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't justify his treatment of Margaret to a gathering crowd that now included one of the most famous athletes in American history. His fellow officers were clearly hoping he would release the elderly woman and find a way to salvage the situation without further embarrassment. "She was interfering with our investigation," Reynolds said weakly, but even he seemed to realize how hollow the words sounded. There was no investigation to speak of, just a welfare check that had gone completely off the rails due to his ego and impatience. Tyson took another step closer, and Reynolds instinctively loosened his grip on Margaret's arm. The boxer's reputation was complex, but everyone knew he had a fierce protective streak, especially when it came to vulnerable people. His own troubled past had given him deep empathy for those who found themselves powerless in difficult situations. "What investigation?" Tyson asked, his tone becoming more pointed. "Looks to me like you're just bullying an old woman who was trying to help." The crowd of neighbors murmured their agreement, emboldened by Tyson's presence to voice their own disapproval of what they were witnessing. The situation had reached a critical point, with Reynolds realizing that his career could be seriously damaged by whatever happened next. Tyson positioned himself between Reynolds and Margaret, creating a physical barrier that made the officers' continued aggression impossible. The former champion's presence was so commanding that Reynolds finally released Margaret's arm completely, leaving visible red marks where his fingers had been. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Tyson asked Margaret gently, his voice completely different from the stern tone he had used with Reynolds. Margaret rubbed her arm where she had been grabbed, nodding, gratefully despite the obvious discomfort. "I'm fine, thank you," Margaret replied with dignity and tact. "I was just trying to help these officers understand that the Martinez family are good people. If they're looking for Carlos, he's at work at the auto repair shop." Even after being manhandled, she was still trying to be helpful and resolve the situation peacefully. Tyson turned back to Reynolds with renewed intensity. "So let me get this straight. This lady was giving you information to help you find who you're looking for, and your response was to grab her and threaten her with arrest?" The absurdity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present, including the two younger officers who were looking increasingly uncomfortable. Reynolds, realizing his authority was slipping away, decided to double down on his aggressive approach. "Mr. Tyson, with all due respect, you need to step back and let us handle this situation. Celebrity status doesn't give you the right to interfere with police work." The comment was a mistake. Tyson's expression hardened, and for a moment, everyone present could see a glimpse of the fierce competitor who had dominated heavyweight boxing for years. "Celebrity status?" he repeated slowly. "This isn't about celebrity anything. This is about basic human decency and treating people with respect." Margaret stepped forward slightly, placing a gentle hand on Tyson's arm. Despite being the victim, in this situation she could sense the tension escalating and wanted to prevent further confrontation. "It's okay," she said quietly. "Let's not make this worse than it needs to be." But Tyson wasn't backing down. Years of therapy had taught him to control his anger, but they had also taught him when it was appropriate to stand firm for what was right. "No, ma'am, it's not okay," he said respectfully but firmly. "Nobody should put their hands on you like that, badge or no badge." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, with people coming out of houses and stopping their cars to see what was happening. Cell phones continued recording, and everyone understood they were witnessing something that would likely become national news. The presence of both Mike Tyson and the obvious injustice being committed against an elderly woman created a perfect storm of public attention. One of the younger officers finally found his courage. "Officer Reynolds," he said quietly, "maybe we should just go check the auto repair shop like the lady suggested." His partner nodded in agreement, both men recognizing that their superior had let his ego turn a simple situation into a potential disaster. Reynolds looked around at the crowd, the cameras, and Mike Tyson's unwavering stare. He was trapped by his own poor decisions, and every second that passed made his position more untenable. The smart thing would be to apologize to Margaret and quietly leave to verify Carlos's whereabouts at his workplace. But pride and years of unchecked authority made it difficult for him to back down gracefully. He had never been publicly challenged like this, especially not by a civilian, and his training had never prepared him for dealing with someone like Mike Tyson who couldn't be easily intimidated. Maria Martinez, who had been watching from her doorway in terrified silence, finally found her voice. "Please," she called out in heavily accented English. "My husband, he work at Tony's shop. You can call. He no do nothing wrong." Her plea added another layer of reality to the situation, reminding everyone that this had all started with a simple welfare check that had gone completely wrong. The standoff continued for several more tense minutes until a sergeant's patrol car arrived on the scene. Sergeant Williams had been monitoring radio chatter and decided to check on what should have been a routine call. As he stepped out of his vehicle and surveyed the scene, his experienced eyes immediately recognized that the situation had spiraled completely out of control. Williams was a 25-year veteran who had seen every type of police situation imaginable. The sight of Mike Tyson facing off with one of his officers, an elderly woman with visible marks on her arm, and a crowd of angry neighbors with cell phones told him everything he needed to know about what had gone wrong. "What's the situation here?" Williams asked calmly, directing his question to Reynolds while acknowledging Tyson with a respectful nod. His tone carried the authority of someone who knew how to de-escalate volatile situations without inflaming them further. Reynolds started to explain his version of events, but Williams held up a hand to stop him. "Let me talk to the complainant first," he said, approaching Margaret with genuine concern. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Margaret showed him her arm where Reynolds had grabbed her, the finger marks still clearly visible against her pale skin. "I'm all right, officer. I was just trying to help them find Carlos Martinez. He works at Tony's auto repair shop on 5th Street. I have the phone number if you'd like to call and verify." Williams examined Margaret's arm and shook his head in disapproval. He then turned to Maria Martinez, who had been watching nervously from her doorway. "Mrs. Martinez, is it? Can you tell me why the officers were here today?" Through broken English supplemented by Margaret's translation, Maria explained that there had been a mistaken report about Carlos being involved in some kind of incident. She produced his work schedule and his employer's contact information, trying to prove that her husband was exactly where he was supposed to be. Williams took out his phone and called Tony's auto repair. The conversation was brief, and when he hung up, he looked directly at Reynolds with obvious displeasure. "Carlos Martinez has been at work since 7 this morning. His boss confirms he's been there all day working on a transmission rebuild." The revelation hit Reynolds like a punch to the gut. Not only had he assaulted an innocent elderly woman, but he had done so while investigating a case where the suspect was exactly where the woman had told him he would be. The irony was devastating and undeniable. Tyson, who had been listening carefully to everything, stepped forward. "So this whole thing could have been resolved with a 2-minute phone call," he said, his voice heavy with disgust. "Instead, you decided to put your hands on a 72-year-old woman who was trying to help you do your job." Williams turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Folks, I need everyone to step back and give us some space to handle this situation properly." His tone was respectful but firm, and people began to comply because they could see he was genuinely trying to fix what his colleague had broken. Reynolds stood silently, realizing that his career was likely over. The combination of assaulting an elderly citizen, ignoring helpful information, and creating a public incident involving Mike Tyson had created a perfect storm of professional destruction. His fellow officers wouldn't even make eye contact with him anymore. Margaret, despite everything she had endured, approached Sergeant Williams with dignity. "Officer, I don't want to cause any trouble for anyone. I just hope this can be resolved peacefully so the Martinez family can have some peace." Her grace in the face of mistreatment impressed everyone present, including Tyson, who looked at her with genuine admiration. Williams nodded respectfully to Margaret. "Ma'am, you've shown remarkable character today. I assure you this will be handled appropriately." He then looked at Reynolds with the expression of a supervisor who was already mentally preparing incident reports and disciplinary paperwork. As the immediate crisis wound down, Sergeant Williams took control of the situation with professional efficiency. He instructed the 2 younger officers to return to the station and file their reports while he dealt with Reynolds personally. The crowd began to disperse, though many neighbors lingered to make sure Margaret was truly okay. Tyson approached Margaret as the official proceedings continued around them. "Ma'am, I want you to know how much I respect what you did today," he said quietly. "Not many people would have stepped up to help their neighbors the way you did. That took real courage." Margaret smiled warmly at the famous boxer. "Thank you for standing up for me, Mr. Tyson. I've watched you fight on television over the years, but I never imagined you were such a gentleman." Her words carried genuine appreciation and a hint of the grandmother's wisdom that had guided her actions throughout the confrontation. "I learned the hard way that real strength isn't about hurting people," Tyson replied thoughtfully. "It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. You reminded me of my own grandmother today, and nobody should ever put their hands on someone's grandmother like that." Williams approached them both, having finished his preliminary investigation. "Mr. Tyson, thank you for intervening when you did. Your presence may have prevented this situation from becoming much worse." He turned to Margaret with obvious remorse. "Ma'am, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for Officer Reynolds' conduct. This is not how we train our officers to interact with the community." Margaret nodded graciously, though the pain in her arm served as a reminder of how quickly things had escalated. "I just hope this doesn't discourage other people from trying to help when they see something wrong happening," she said. "We all have to look out for each other." The Martinez family, who had been watching anxiously from their doorway throughout the entire incident, finally felt safe enough to approach. Maria walked over to Margaret with tears in her eyes, embracing the elderly woman who had risked her own safety to defend them. "Gracias, señora," Maria whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for helping my family." Her children peeked out from behind her, still confused by everything that had happened, but understanding that this kind lady had helped protect their mother. Tyson watched the interaction with visible emotion, remembering his own childhood experiences with community members who had looked out for him when his own family situation was chaotic. "This is what neighborhoods should be about," he said to Williams. "People taking care of each other, not afraid of each other." Williams nodded in agreement, then addressed the practical matters that remained. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to need you to come to the station to file a formal complaint and have those marks on your arm photographed for evidence. Officer Reynolds will be suspended pending a full investigation." As the official vehicles began to leave the scene, Tyson lingered to make sure Margaret had transportation to the police station and someone to accompany her. When he learned she had planned to walk, he immediately offered to drive her there himself, ensuring she wouldn't have to face the bureaucratic process alone. The incident, which had started as a routine police call, became a powerful reminder about the importance of community solidarity and standing up for what's right, regardless of the potential consequences. Margaret's quiet courage and Tyson's unexpected intervention had turned a moment of injustice into a lesson about human dignity and mutual protection. Years later, Margaret and Mike Tyson would remain friends, bonded by the shared experience of that September morning when an elderly woman's compassion and a former champion's protective instincts combined to stand against abuse of power. The Martinez family would eventually move to a larger house, but they never forgot the neighbor who had risked everything to defend them when they needed help most.